Everybody. I want to look at this piece from Jenny Presnell. This is from the book, The Information Literate Historian. And Presnell is actually a librarian and is well acquainted with the different kinds of historical sources. And that's, I think, primarily what I want to discuss from her work today. This is just a few pages. It covers some of the same territory as the Tosh reading, and so I don't want to belabor the point there, but I just want to reinforce maybe some of the things that were said. Looking at page 6 here, she notes in the second paragraph, the study of history is not unbiased, despite the best attempts and intentions of historians. Each historian's past and present influence the questions he or she will ask about the topics of history under consideration, right? And each historian brings a unique perspective. And, we discussed about 19th century invention of historicism in Germany, where they tried to apply the objectivity of science to the study of history and, tried to remove the historian's personal views entirely from the equation. I think that was a necessary corrective at that point, because history, up to that point, the old adage is that the winners always write history, right? That was kind of the bias that went into things. It was like, whatever one's personal perspective is, that was what was right in history, and anything that opposed that was wrong. And the historicism tried to get away from that and understand things as they actually happened. However, historians have come around to the notion that bias is inevitable, first of all, and it can actually be productive as long as it doesn't get in the way of a good historical inquiry. Obviously, some biases are problematic if you approach history with, from, say, a racist vantage point or something like that. That can really get in the way of writing good history. If the bias becomes a prejudice, we might say, it becomes problematic. But to continue on here, she writes, good historical questions originate from personal experiences or from your curiosity. And I think there's something to be said for personal curiosity. Like, what do you find interesting, right? And it was really liberating for me personally when I first discovered this. It's like, well, I really like I'm interested in these kinds of issues. I like to study these sorts of things. And it was like, I can look at that in history, right? I can kind of geek out over these things that are really interesting to me. And that's one of the things that I think really can be said about the discipline of history, is it allows you to study what's interesting to you. So hopefully something in this course that you're taking will be interesting. Hopefully you can find an angle that is personally appealing. Now, the rest of this paragraph and the next paragraph, I think, are at the crux of what I want to discuss in this video. Historians break sources into two types. Now, by sources, we mean information about history, right? The one that's the most important are what we call primary sources. Okay, primary source evidence is evidence that comes from the actual period, the events, the circumstances in question. And so for studying ancient Greece, for instance, we would need to find materials that were written during that time, or material remains, artifacts that were made or owned during that period of time, or art that was produced during that time. Historians work primarily with written evidence, but it's not exclusive. They also work with material remains and art, and they get along very well, I think, hopefully, with anthropologists and art historians and others who work primarily with those materials, okay? And so we need to find evidence that comes from that time period. If there is no evidence from that time period, or the evidence is little, is scarce, we have to read it closely. We have to try to corroborate it with as much other information as we can, and we need to maybe think creatively about what can constitute a primary source. In some cases, the sources are not immediate, meaning they don't come from the immediate circumstances, but maybe they were written or produced somewhat later, and we can use them to corroborate with evidence that's maybe more proximate to this, right? And as a general rule, the further back you go in history, the more scarce the evidence is. There are certain areas of the world as well that didn't necessarily produce written evidence, right, until fairly recent times. And so we have to use other kinds of evidence to try to grasp what was happening in the past, okay? Now, so hopefully that explains, at least it gives an initial explanation for what primary source evidence is. You really can't do history without studying primary sources. That's absolutely necessary for this, okay? And so, whatever historical event or historical circumstances you're interested in, try to locate primary sources for that, stuff that comes from the actual time period. Now, Presnell goes on to say in this chapter, right, interpreting these remnants and artifacts can be challenging, requiring imagination as well as collaboration and discussion with other historians and scholars in other disciplines. And so I highlighted there requiring imagination. I think that imagination is a key component of the mental furniture of a good student of history, right? You have to try to imagine what life was like at the time period in question. You have to use your imagination to try to make connections between the source material and other things that you know about that. This isn't just a straightforward exercise. It often involves a great deal of kind of mental leaps from one thing to another. I had a professor in grad school who used the phrase imaginative leaps, which I really like, right? That maybe the source material tells us this one thing, and maybe this other thing that seems unrelated, but we can make an imaginative leap from the one thing that we know to the other thing that we know and maybe fill in the gaps between, right? And so that's all vital here, okay? Now, the other type of source that historians use or encounter is what we call secondary sources. And let's just read Presnell's definition here. Secondary sources are the interpretations of a topic by other historians that draw on primary sources and other interpretive works to build an argument about a historical idea. Okay, so secondary sources are works of scholarship. In Europe, this is simply called the literature, right, in the field, and then the primary sources are simply called the sources. And so the reason for this, or the reason that historians or students of history need to know about this, right, is that there are conversations ongoing about issues in history. Whatever your historical topic, chances are some historian has written about it at some point and offered an interpretation. And it's necessary as a student of history to know at least a little bit about what some of those interpretations are. Like, what have historians said? We can, once we're aware of that, we can decide that we agree with it. We can decide we disagree with it. We can take certain parts of it and use that to kind of come up with our own original arguments about things, okay? The important thing is that this is all part of a conversation. When you make an argument, which is what your assignments in this class are going to ask you to do, right? You make an argument, you are then giving an opinion based on your own critical analysis of the sources about what it all means, right? What was happening, why it was happening, why people did the things they did, thought the thoughts that they did. Sorry, I'm getting a little tongue-tied here. Produce the evidence that they produced, right? Why did all of this happen the way it happened? That is not self-evident, or it's very rarely self-evident. That's where you need to use your imagination, and knowing what has been said about this is really helpful, right? And so historians, as it says at the bottom of the page here, carefully study the scholarship of their peers as they conduct their research in order to find interrelationships among these works and sometimes among the work of scholars in other disciplines. I think students of history can bring the methodologies, the techniques of something like psychology or sociology or anthropology or even like the hard sciences, the natural sciences at times, and use that as a way to encounter the evidence from the past and try to interpret it, okay? And there are certain, as she goes into the schools of historical inquiry here, I don't want to put too fine a point on that, right? In an introductory class, we're not necessarily getting into an Al's school or Marxist interpretation or postmodernism or something like that, right? But there are kind of whole schools of thought that have developed around particular ways of approaching the past, right? Traditionally, history, going back to like the 18th and 19th centuries, was largely like biography about important people, looking at, mostly dead white European men who, were kings and leaders and generals and things like that. And it was thought that that was all that history consisted of. Well, starting in the early 20th century, historians decided they wanted to try to understand what the common people were experiencing in the past. And so they began to look at other kinds of evidence and to use things like statistics and the literature that was coming out of other social scientific disciplines to, to approach history in a different way, right? And so, as you go on in your study of history, you may eventually come to an opinion about, what kind of history you'd like to do, maybe even attach yourself to a historical school. That's not necessary for an introductory class, but it is good to be aware of it, right? The rest of the stuff in this chapter, I think, is these are issues that have been covered to some extent in Tosh, right? She gives a series of questions you can ask about the evidence of the past, like historical significance, right? Why is something significant? What made it significant? Who says whether it's significant? Is that judgment that somebody renders about the significance of an issue accurate? Do we agree with that, right? That's one question you can ask about history, and that would be like the secondary source information and your own interpretation of primary sources to decide whether you agree about the significance of something, okay? We talked about continuity and change already a little bit, right? I mean, this is something definitely to notice, like what changed, what remains the same, the sequence of events. This is what Tosh called the process of history, right? All history is part of a process. Events don't happen in isolation from one another. We talked about progress and decline already. I think that we need to be careful not to, think of history all as all progress or all decline, but we can certainly use that vocabulary to help describe the past. This last paragraph on page 9 here, I think, is especially important, right? What do we do with evidence? Okay, the same evidence can lead historians, Presnell writes, to different conclusions, depending on the mix of primary source evidence and new considerations of their meaning. And then this sentence, I think, is key to the entire course, the entirety of learning how to inquire historically. Be sure to identify the origin of the source. So if you're encountering a primary source, say, a letter written in the past, or a piece of literature, or a piece of art, or something like that, right? Identify the origin of the source, contextualize it, and corroborate its contents with other primary and secondary sources. So what was going on during the time that would have led to this thing being written or produced? And then how does this relate to other evidence? Like what else is out there that would help us understand what was going on? Use those things in collaboration with each other. The assignments in this class will have you read things, but not in isolation from other evidence, right? We need to try to contextualize as much as possible. And then a final point, historical empathy. We've mentioned this already, I think, in earlier videos. But be sure, by empathy, we don't mean, crying over the plight of past people, though that's, I've certainly done that as I've read very troubling things in history, right? I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing, but empathy in a sense of trying to imagine yourself, as Presnell writes, in a time and a culture, and to connect with individuals without influences from the researcher's contemporary world. Remove yourself from your own circumstances. Try to read history on its terms. Let it speak to you. Let your knowledge of the context lead you into a different world. And then let your empathy take over as you begin to interpret the source evidence. Okay, so hopefully that's some helpful material to think about as you begin your process of inquiring historically.